Now to read this next chart called All Motion is Spiral and the Law. Mass is an accumulation of the universal constant of energy into higher potential. The greater the mass, the greater the potential. Mass accumulates inductively along the centrifugal lines of closing spirals and is rotated by the impact of genero-active force. Mass dissipates conductively along centrifugal lines of opening spirals and is rotated by the expulsion of radioactive force. These opposite forces are the cause of rotation of mass. This chart, describing the electromagnetic process of mass formation. All mass is accumulated centrifugally by the genero-active gravitative attractive power of electricity and is dissipated centrifugally by the radioactive repelling power of magnetism. And now to begin reading where I left off. Thinking then is a process of generation of motion in variable opposition out of a state of maximum motion in non-variable inertia and of radiation back into that state again. The inertial line is that hypothetical line of absolute non-opposition between the oscillations of the two opposing forces of motion. At the inertial line, the two opposing forces are neutralized and in equilibrium. At the inertial line, there is no force back of motion, but there is the impetus of the magnetic radiative pulsation, which continues motion across the inertial line without force. Once across the line, motion is continued by the electrogenerative pulsation until magnetic conquest causes it to rebound. That state of motion which continues motion without force back of it will be known as inertial energy. Let me read that again. That state of motion which continues motion without force back of it will be known as inertia energy. The inertial line or plane might be characterized as the axis along which wave expressions of the universal constant of energy are born. The mechanic might characterize it as the dead center between force and force, where no force exists. This point can only be passed by the impetus given to an object in motion prior to its arrival at that point. Motion is continuous as thinking is continuous. The universe breathes, inhaling and exhaling as man breathes, and as every light unit, atom, and molecule breathes, and as everything in the firmament above and the waters below breathes. Exhalation and inhalation in sequence is a characteristic of all phenomena of matter. Motion is caused by the sequence of opposing impulses of thinking. All direction of motion and effects of motion are governed by these equally balanced gravitative and repulsive and equally balanced decelerative and accelerative forces. The opposition of the two apparently opposing forces which cause apparently opposite impulses forms spiral waves along which the ideal produced in thinking is registered. The registered ideal of thinking is expressed gravitatively in what man calls the elements of matter, and repulsively in what man calls the magnetic flow or magnetic lines of force in heretofore unknown magnetic orbits. All elements of matter are radiative or radioactive, just as all matter is generative or genero-active. Electrically generating elements and magnetically radiating lines of force are the same force exerted in apparently opposite directions. The former is centrifugal and its direction is toward the nuclear center of its closing spiral. The latter is centrifugal, and its direction is away from the center toward the opening spiral. Their difference is but a rising or lowering of potential. One always becomes the other. Each is the cause of the other. Radioactivity is a lowering of potential into higher octaves of elements of greater speed but lesser power. General activity is the increasing of potential into lower octaves of greater power and lesser speed. General activity builds the elements. Radioactivity tears them apart. The elements are composed of apparently separate particles in motion, which shall henceforth be called light units or corpuscles. The spiral genero-radiative waves are the medium of reproduction of idea throughout the entirety of the universe. All idea of mind produced by thinking is reproduced through the entirety of the universe of mind in measurable waves of electromagnetic opposition. These apparently opposing genero-radiative waves constitute the creating and decreating universe of integrating and disintegrating elements of potential energy, which man calls the created physical universe. Man has measured the speed at which the energies of light appear to travel along waves as 186,400 miles per second. This measure is the highest measure of the perceptible impulses of universal thinking. This is the measure of energy reproduction which man calls the speed of light. Man's concept of the speed of light as being uniform is a wrong concept. To man, light is incandescent luminosity. To man, that which is not glowingly incandescent is not light. All matter is light. This universe is one of light. Solids of matter, heavy, dark, and cold, are as much light as flaming Arcturus. Luminosity is but a state of intensely unequalized and opposing motion, sustained in its state of unequalized motion by the generation of high pressures. It is but one state of the substance of mind in motion, a state which is within a limited range of electromagnetic charge, temperature, and opposition, a range which varies in intensity in each octave, but which runs the whole gamut of its limitations in the 10-octave cycle. Incandescent luminosity is but the state of maximum opposition of the two apparently opposing forces, and a state in which radiative resistance to generation is at its maximum, a state in which contraction by maximum genero-active accumulation of time into power is resisting expansion by radiative dissipation of power into time, of which much will be written in its proper place. Incandescent luminosity is that state of motion which will be known as the high potential of a system or an octave. It is the meeting place of centripetal and centrifugal forces, of preponderantly male and preponderantly female, of maximum electromagnetic opposition, and it is the state of maximum registration of heat. It is the turning point where the power of electricity to generate mind substance into the appearance of form yields to the power of magnetism to radiate it back into the disappearance of form. Man's speed of light is the speed at which the state of motion in opposition, known as incandescent luminosity, appears to travel through those high octaves of integrating matter which man calls empty space, or the ether of space. This measure of light is but the high measure of a great range of apparent speeds. All of the elements of matter in all states of motion are but orderly and periodic variations of the one substance, light. As there are innumerable states of motion of the substance of light, so also are there innumerable so-called speeds of light.